G'day guys, Socket here. Today we're going to do take 2 of our speaker aiming tutorial. I published a version of this a little earlier in the week and there was an error or two in there and I didn't think I really covered the topic appropriately, so I thought I'd scrap that first version and release a take 2 version, which is this video right here today. So the original question about speaker aiming came from Barry, who's one of our Patreon members and a super top bloke. His question is, if mounting the mids on pillars, how important is to have them on axis? I have some prefab pods that I was thinking of using, but the driver's side mid would be a bit off axis, pointing more towards the center of the car. Well, Barry, the answer to that question is it depends. And so what do I mean by it depends? Well, let's jump on in and we'll take a look. So what do I mean when I say it depends? Well, I always try to put my speakers on axis to the listening position because I feel that I get better results with fewer bounces and reflections for the sound to be able to reach your ears. But that is not always possible. Now, if you're doing a fully custom build and you have complete freedom about where you position your speakers and how you aim them, then absolutely you've got a lot of choice. But not everybody wants to do that. If you have you want to maintain your car's OEM and use the OEM locations, then it becomes far more difficult. And so how important is speaker aiming? Which speakers need to be aimed and which speakers can you get away with the speakers being off axis? Well, let's go and take a look at all of those questions, and hopefully along the way we'll be able to answer Barry's question about is it okay to have his mids slightly off axis. So let's talk about speaker aiming. So different speakers playing different frequencies have different what we call dispersion patterns. And so, for example, your low frequency drivers like your subwoofers are what we call omnidirectional. It doesn't really matter which way you face them because the sound comes out of the sub kind of like as in a sphere from the center of the sub, and it radiates out in all different directions, like a ball of sound. Whereas other speakers like your tweeters are quite the opposite. They are very directional, and they sort of send the sound out almost like a beam, right? Like a flashlight beam of light, right? And you can check this out yourself if you just sit in front of a tweeter, and look at the speaker, and so your head is in the on axis with the tweeter, and your ears are sort of in the beam that it's projecting, and then just move your sort of head from side to side and you'll see what happens to the sound as you move in and out of that beam of sound coming from the tweeter, right? So the factor that affects the directionality of how a speaker plays is the frequency. So let me just pull up this little chart and we'll walk through it and I'll explain what I mean. So guys, this is what they call a polar response graph. It's typically used by the home audio guys when they're comparing bookshelf speakers and stuff like that. But it's a useful diagram for us to sort of explain this concept of omnidirection and directionality and those types of things that we've just been talking about. So the way you read this graph is there. For example, there's a speaker in the middle of what is basically a compass, and the speaker is playing in the direction of the red arrow here. So if you were at 0 degrees, you would be what we call on axis. And then these other, degrees readings, indicate how far off axis you're sitting in relation to the speaker. So, if you're sitting a little bit to the side of the speaker, you might be 30 degrees off axis. If you're sitting to the side of the speaker, you'd be at 90 degrees off axis. And if you were directly behind the speaker, you'd be at what we call 180 degrees off axis. So the other part of the chart is these coloured lines. They plot the response of the chart and what you would be hearing in terms of volume level, depending on how off axis you are and the frequency that's being played. So for example, let's look at this yellow one, which is a 2000 hertz tone. so you can see this yellow one that kind of goes like that. If you were sitting directly on axis, you would be getting, the full volume level. But if you were sitting over here at 90 degrees, the volume level would be sort of about half the volume that you would be getting if you were sitting directly in front of it. If that kind of makes sense, you can see that sort of halfway down the graph, right? So that's the way you kind of read these charts. But what it is useful in demonstrating is, for example, let's pretend we had a sub or a mid bass or something here in the center of the compass, and it was playing a 100 hertz tone. Now, I don't have a 100 hertz tone on the chart, but basically, if I did, you would see that the response would be almost a perfect circle. You can see that the 600 hertz tone here is not a perfect circle, but it's not too far off. But certainly, when you get into those lower tones, the shape of the response gets more circular. And what that means is basically, whether you're sitting in front of a sub or to the side or behind a sub, the sound is pretty much the same in both what you hear and the volume, because the sound is what we call omnidirectional. So it doesn't really matter which way you face the sub, you will get the sound, same kind of sound level, right? Now, that is opposite to high frequency drivers like tweeters, where the sound is very directional. And so if you look at this 8,000 and 12,000, plots, this kind of purpley one and the blue one here, you can see that, most of the volume or sound detail is when you are directly on axis, and once you're to the side or behind the speaker, where you're very off axis, you can virtually hear nothing at all. And this is what we mean by directionality. And the higher you are in frequency, the more directional the sound waves, right? And so, for example, if I'm using tweeters, which are very directional, you'll tend to find that when you're sitting on axis to them, not only will they be the loudest, but they'll also be able to hear all of the detail that that speaker is playing. As soon as you start moving off axis, 15, 30 degrees, the volume starts to drop quite sharply, and also the level of detail that you hear, especially those high level twinkles and things in the tweeters, you'll tend not to hear them as well as if you were sitting on axis. And that's why we always recommend to have your tweeters on axis to the listening position, or at most 15 to 30 degrees. But once you get beyond that, then they're not going to work as well. Alright, so this plot is useful for kind of explaining the concept, and I hope that kind of made a bit of sense. But I'll show you a bit of a technique a little bit later about how you can take your own measures to work out the impact of directionality, with the speakers in your particular setup in your car. So that's all very interesting, but how does it help answer Barry's question? Well, to answer Barry's question, we need to work out what we call the speaker's beaming frequency. And so the beaming frequency is the wavelength of sound divided by pi that equals the speaker diameter. So if I take my speaker and I pull up the spec sheet, and I'm just going to use this little 3-inch focal mid-range, and I look at the spec sheet, and it's going to be around about 73 millimeters. Now, if I want to be super accurate, I can go out and measure, the actual diameter of the speaker cone, because sometimes these specifications show the speaker cone or sometimes the mounting holes, so be careful which one you're reading. But if you want to be super accurate, certainly go and measure the speaker cone itself. But for this example, I'm just going to use 73 millimeters. So the beaming frequency is the frequency below which the speaker will be omnidirectional. And it's calculated by working out the speed of sound divided by pi times the diameter of the speaker, all in centimeters, right? So we know the speed of sound is 343 meters per second, which works out to be 34,300 centimeters. Pi is 3.1. The diameter of our 73 millimeter speaker in centimeters is 7.3. And we plug that into our calculator and we get a result of 1,496 hertz. So that means that our 73 millimeter speaker is omnidirectional up to about 1500 hertz, right? So this means that the speaker is, from this point, is starting to become more and more directional as the goes up the frequency scale. And so if you kind of look at this, in a bit of a diagram, you've got your speaker playing omnidirectional. It gets up to the point of, the beaming frequency, right? And before that, it's omnidirectional. After that, it's becoming more and more directional, right? And it goes through a bit of what we call a transition zone, right? Where it's, not fully directional yet, but it's certainly no longer omnidirectional, right? It's this kind of little grey zone. And then by the time it reaches this point, it's what we would probably call fully directional, if that makes sense. And so we have two different formulas. We have what we call 1C and 2C that allows us to calculate the beginning of this transition zone and the end of this transition zone, right? And the difference between the two formulas is this little digit 2, where we are doubling the speed of sound, right? And we'll have a look at that. It's probably easier to have a look at it on the RTA plot, right? So here is a RTA plot of a mid-range playing in full range, so with no crossover at this end, and you can see the different degrees off axis for these different plots. So this blue line here is sitting directly on axis, listening to the mid-range, and then we get to 15 degrees and it's dropped a little bit in volume, and down here at 45 it's dropped even more, and at 60 degrees off axis it's dropped quite a lot. So the beaming frequency, this one here at 1 times the speed of sound, is this point here, right, where it starts to separate. And and at this stage it's only a dB or two, maybe between 0 and 60 degrees, and by this point it's probably down by 3, and maybe 3.5 by this point. But C2, the calculation of C2, is where we would define the end of this transition zone, right? So you can, if you want to be super conservative, you can use the beaming frequency, that 1 times the speed of sound, or you can use the second formula if you want to be a little less conservative, right? But just to be aware that it doesn't suddenly go from omnidirectional to fully directional. There is a little bit of a transition zone between the two. So the beaming frequency, or C2 as I refer to it, is the frequency above which the speaker will be fully directional, right? And so that is calculated by 2 times the speed of sound divided by 3.14 by 7.3, which is the centimetres size of our diameter of our speaker, and that gives us a beaming frequency for C2 of close to 3000 hertz. So it's double the frequency of 1C, right? So in other words, our 73mm speaker will be directional beyond 3000 hertz. So now that we have both of those measures, what does that kind of all mean? Well, let's go take a look. Okay, so here we have a plot of a mid-range speaker, and if we calculate our beaming frequency of this 73mm speaker, we end up with a beaming frequency of 1496 hertz, or about 1500 hertz, right? So it's about this point here, and that means that below this frequency, the speaker is acting in an omnidirectional manner, and above this, it's becoming more and more directional the higher the frequency, right? And as we said before, if we are playing the mid-range as a wideband, so for example, we're not going to match it with the speaker, and this is going to play all of these frequencies, then it's probably going to be a good idea to put this mid-range directly on axis to your listening position. Otherwise, as you get up into these frequencies or beyond this point, the impact of the volume and the detail that you're hearing, once after you get 15, 30, 60 degrees off axis, is going to be more and more, just like we saw in the the RTA plots here. You're going to have more and more of an impact the higher you go up in the frequencies, right? So that's only if you're deciding to use your speaker as a wideband, right? If you happen to match it, however, up with a tweeter, then okay, the situation is a little different, because once you get beyond the tweeters crossover and where the two speakers are sort of playing the same frequencies, then the tweeter will be playing these high level frequencies, and you pretty much are going to have your tweeter on axis anyway, right? Or you'd hope so. And so, for example, let's say that we're crossing the tweeter and the mid at 3,200 hertz. That's going to be our crossover frequency. So, kind of just beyond this frequency, the tweeter is going to, take over these, the playing of these directional wavelengths, and the mid doesn't matter so much anymore, because it's not playing these directional wavelengths. So you're really only worried about this frequency zone through here. But if we apply what we were talking about before, that this is where the speaker is below this frequency, the speaker is omnidirectional. Beyond this point, it's starting to get directional. If we apply that, what we called that C2 measure before, and we have this little transition zone, the situation's even better, because we know that, above 2292, the mid-range is playing fully directional now. And, between that and the crossover is a tiny, tiny little bit. So you probably would not worry too much. If you had your tweeter crossed a little bit higher, around about the 5,000 mark, okay, well then maybe, that's going to be a bit of a problem. Or if you have your tweeter cross much lower at 2,500, well then, the situation's even better for you. So this is one way of using these beaming frequencies and your crossovers to sort of figure out whether the tweeter is going to take over from your mid-range and solve your directionality problem for you or not. So guys, what I've done is I've gone ahead and crunched some numbers for the most common sizes of speakers, from a 1-inch speaker all the way down to a 12-inch subwoofer. And the one of the takeouts of this table is that all speakers beam, even your subwoofer. Okay, so if I'm looking at a 2-inch tweeter, the beaming frequency is going to be, start off at 2150. It's going to be omnidirectional below that, and then by the time it hits 4300, it's going to be fully beaming, right? And and I marked that as green because this beaming range, transitional range that we work with, is in what I would call the typical range that we would be operating a 2-inch tweeter, right? You're probably running your tweeter from, I don't know, 2,000, 2.5, maybe 3,000 and up. And so beaming is going to be something that you need to consider when you're aiming this particular speaker, because you are operating it within the typical beaming frequency, and 4300 and above, it's going to be beaming, right? And you're typically using this 2-inch speaker beyond 2000, right? Typically. But when we get down to, for example, a subwoofer, it also beams, but the beaming starts at about 358 hertz, and the C2, where it's beaming full and above, is 717. But we would not typically be running our subwoofers at those types of frequencies. We typically have a subwoofer and it might be running up to 80, maybe 100, 120 at most, right? So this beaming for subwoofers is not really a problem, because we don't usually play them in the frequency range that beaming kind of occurs. Now what about the things in the middle? So let's have a look at, for example, a 6.5-inch mid bass. Once again, if we plug in all the numbers, the beginning of the, it's omnidirectional up to 662. You have it transitioning to 1300, and above 1300 it's beaming, right? But once again, how high do you play your 6.5 mid-range? Certainly I would probably play it up to 200, maybe 250, and it wouldn't necessarily be a problem for me. But some people play them much higher than that. Some people play them 500, 600, it really depends on your personal choices, but certainly once you start sort of getting up beyond 600, you need to consider how off axis you are, and I guess aiming your speaker becomes more important, right? And then once we get up into your mids, let's say I'm using a 3-inch mid, well, we kind of already talked about, let's look at a 4-inch, same type of thing. It'll omnidirectional up to about 1,000, bit of a transition by 2,000, it's fully, directional. And now, once again, you're probably playing your 4-inch mid, into this range, so that's why I put these different colors against these different things. But the takeaway from this slide is, one, all speakers beam. It's just a matter of whether you are operating your speakers above the beaming zone or within and above the beaming zone that you really need to take into consideration your speaker aiming. So guys, up to now we've been talking about speaker aiming, but it is not the only factor when it comes to how your speakers will sound from a particular location in your car. There are a bunch of other things that will influence how your speakers sound and respond, and that includes how they've been installed. Are they in a pod? Are they in a box? Are they in a IB configuration? Are they on the dash, the pillars? Are they down on the doors or in the kicks? All of those things have a influence, along with the type of speaker, the brand it is, the material it's made out of. So many different factors will determine how your speakers sound in your car. Now, the things that we've been talking about, like polar response diagrams and calculating out your beaming frequencies, these are all handy tools. But you can just use them as a guide because they are just mathematical calculations. They won't necessarily be 100% accurate, depending on your particular installation, where it's located in your car, and your vehicle characteristics. Right. The only real way to work that out 100% accurately is to do some measurements. Now, the most simple way to check this type of stuff is to simply play some pink noise and stick your head in front of the speaker so you are completely on axis, and then move your head from side to side to determine just how far off axis can you get before the speaker starts to sound reduced in volume and you lose the detail and dynamics of the speaker. Just how far can you get away from being on axis until you really start to notice it, right? That is the simplest way to, and I guess the quickest way to really determine, whether how far off axis you can be with your particular speaker and setup. Now, the other way is to do some RTA measurements. It takes a little bit of mucking around and positioning the speaker and this type of thing, and not everyone will want to do it, but if you have plenty of time on your hands and you want to have a play, then let me show you how to do that. So here is the RTA plot of the mid-range speaker, and if you wanted to come up with your own version of this, so you can see how your speaker is performing at different degrees of off-axis, then, you would probably have to go out to your car and do something like this. So, for example, here is a picture of, my little Audi, and, if I was doing this, I'd go and take measurements at different degrees of off-axis, and then I could probably produce a similar chart, in REW, right? And the way I would go about that is to, first of all, measure with the mic in a static position. So just like taking sweeps, this is not a moving mic method. You need to have the mic fixed in a certain fixed position when you're taking these measures. And you need to measure from the speaker to the microphone, because you need to have the microphone at exactly the same distance from the speaker each time you take the measurement as you move from position to position, right? So you need to measure that distance first. Set up the speaker that you're playing so it's playing full range, right? So if you remember when we were taking full range measures very early in the tuning process, that means that you're playing the speaker without crossovers. Now, I've got to say, the only speaker that you should have a crossover is your tweeters. You need to put a 1000 Hertz crossover on your tweeters to make sure that they're protected, because you don't want them playing notes below 1000 hertz because it could cause damage to your speakers. But otherwise, you'll be playing your speakers in full range. Next, you then play pink noise through the speaker that you're measuring. Measure the speaker response just like we're doing when you're doing your tuning, and then move your speaker to the next location. So that might be 15 degrees or whatever it is that you are, from the speaker, 15, 30, 45, and so on and so forth, and just move the speaker to the next location. Make sure it's at the same distance. Play your pink noise and do another measure, and just save all of those measures in REW, and then you can bring up all SPL and take a look. So that is one way of creating your own RTA plots. And then once you have that, you can have a look at how the speaker is performing. So, so 0 degrees and 15 degrees and how much it is dropping, the further that you get off axis, right? And that will give you some valuable information about your speaker aiming. Now, that's all good and well. You might, for example, have a speaker set up like this, and you want to know how is it responding in its current position versus being completely on axis. And an easy way of measuring that would be to sit in opposite the speaker, not in your listening position, but for example maybe the passenger in this right-hand drive car. Measure the response from the seated position. Measure your distance to the speaker, so that might be 70 centimeters or something, and then take a measurement directly on axis with the speaker at 70 centimeters, same distance, and then compare the two responses. So you can see just how much of an effect being off axis is with your current speaker position. And once again, you can look at the plot of how it is, normally might be the green one, and the blue one here might be, when you're measuring it, completely on axis, and you can see what the effect of this speaker being currently on axis might be, right? If that kind of makes sense, right? The other thing to keep in mind when you're doing these measures is speakers that are reflecting off glass, such as mid-mount dash mounted speakers. Okay, so the key thing here is that when you're measuring these types of speakers, you will typically get a dip in the response where the reflection is bouncing off the glass. So you can see that dip here. Quite normal and quite typical with sound waves bouncing off glass, right? But anyway, like I said, this is by no means something that you have to do to work out speaker aiming and whether it's having an effect in terms of directionality on in terms of your aiming of your speakers. This is just something that if you'd like to have a play around with, you can certainly have a go, and be interesting to see some of your plots. So guys, I guess to sum everything up, speaker aiming and directionality is most important with speakers that are playing above 2000 hertz. Below that, your speakers are pretty omnidirectional and it's less important. Now, this isn't going to help you if you have your speakers in OEM locations. Car manufacturers generally put speakers in places that suit them best, not necessarily the best locations. So if you've got your tweeters in the door or something like that, and they're directly facing across the car from each other, well, there's not much you can do about that unless you're going to relocate them to a different position. But if you are thinking about custom locations, or you're thinking about relocating your tweeters, then you can take some of this information kind of into account. So if I had to sort of distill everything into a few rules of thumb, first of all, I would say 2000 and above, and you should consider your speaker aiming. Outside of that, your subs and your mid bass less important, because as I said before, speaker aiming is just one of the factors that will affect how your speaker sounds at the listening position. And for things like subs, it's whether you got them facing backwards or forwards or down firing, It's less important in terms of how they sound. Mid-bass, slightly different. If you've got them under the seats and they're firing up into the bottom of the seat, then, they're probably not going to play above 150 hertz. If they're in the kicks, they're going to respond differently. In the doors, they're going to respond differently and probably have a cancellation, around the 120, 150 mark where the sound wave is bouncing off the console. But they're all completely different factors than speaker aiming. They're all to do with your locations and that type of thing, as opposed to aiming. And that is a topic for another day. But certainly when it gets up to your tweeters and your mids, tweeters, certainly I always like to have them completely on axis. If that bothers some people to have the passenger side pointed at the driver, and it doesn't look symmetrical. Some people don't like that look. Some people want to have the passenger experience a good sounding system as much as the driver, and therefore then you probably want to have your speakers, I guess, more symmetrical. But if you're doing a one seat tune, which is most people that are building SQ cars, then having the tweeters directly pointed at you will give you the best response, because not only are you getting the maximum volume, but you're also getting all the details that those upper airy details and sparkle and stuff that you don't get when the tweeter is significantly off axis from you. And so 15 degrees is okay, 30 degrees is probably okay. Once you get beyond 30 degrees, then you're going to certainly impact the level of detail that you're starting to hear. And certainly with tweeters, I'm not a huge fan of tweeters that fire from the A pillars directly across the dash at each other. Anyway, it's just not a configuration that I think is super effective for tweeters. But if that's your OEM setup, as I said, there's not much you can do about that. When it comes to your mid-range, as we already discussed, it really depends on how you're using that mid-range, whether you're using it as a wideband, whether you're pairing it with a tweeter, where you're crossing over that tweeter. But in general, once again, I like to have my mid-range on axis as much as possible. Like I said, if you're 15, 30, 45 degrees off axis, it's probably not too bad. When you start getting to 60 degrees and beyond, then certainly once again the level of detail or the loss of volume becomes a problem. And the loss of volume is not necessarily an issue, because you can always balance it up with your DSP and with gains. It's the level of detail and the dynamic response that you're hearing from the speaker as you get more off axis that you can't really fix with the DSP. So yeah, I guess if I boil it all down, subwoofers, I don't worry. I figure out where's the best location to put them, and it worries me less about which way I face them. My mid-bass, similar. I put them in the best locations that I can fit them, but I don't worry too much about aiming. The mids I tend to put on axis where I can, and the tweeters definitely on axis if I can. So that kind of sums up how I like to set up my cars for speaker aiming. So guys, that brings us to the end of this episode. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed it, and to Barry, I hope that sort of answered your question, mate. And if you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to drop them below. I will get back to you as soon as I can. And also, once again, big shout out to all of the Patreon viewers. I really appreciate your support, and I hope you're enjoying the content that's over on the Patreon channel. There are still a few spaces left, so if you're interested in joining our community over there, come on over. Otherwise, guys, once again, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode.